Every superpower in history believed its dominance would last forever. Spain believed it, Britain believed it, the Soviet Union believed it, and each one collapsed anyway, not because an enemy was stronger, but because the system inside them broke first. Collapse doesn't begin with invasion, it begins with exhaustion, rising costs, rising debt, and a currency that slowly loses trust. Here's the uncomfortable part. The United States is now moving through the same sequence, step by step, decision by decision, not suddenly, quietly, and most people won't realize it until the shift is already irreversible. History shows that collapse rarely begins with defeat. It begins with success. Empires expand, trade grows, wealth increases, and influence spreads across the globe. Everything appears strong and permanent. But beneath the surface, the costs of maintaining dominance begin to exceed the benefits. Military commitments multiply, financial obligations expand, and the system grows larger than its ability to sustain itself. The turning point doesn't arrive with a crisis. It arrives when success becomes too expensive to maintain. Every dominant power rests on three pillars: economic strength, military reach, and trust in its currency. When these pillars are balanced, influence expands and stability appears permanent. But maintaining global dominance is expensive. Trade routes must be protected, alliances must be supported, and military presence must be sustained across vast distances. At first, growth pays for expansion. Over time, expansion must be financed through borrowing. Debt begins to replace production, and the system starts consuming more resources than it creates. The transition from strength to vulnerability is almost invisible. Taxes no longer cover expanding obligations, so borrowing fills the gap. Currency supply increases to support spending, while production slowly shifts to cheaper regions abroad. The system still appears stable. Markets function, and daily life continues as normal. But the balance is gone. The empire begins to consume more than it produces, and dependence quietly replaces self-sufficiency. From this point forward, reversal becomes increasingly difficult, and every new crisis accelerates the imbalance. In the 16th century, Spain controlled the greatest flow of wealth the world had ever seen. Silver from the Americas poured into Europe, their currency dominated global trade, and their military power stretched across continents. It appeared to be an age of unstoppable prosperity. But vast wealth created dependency instead of resilience. Spain imported goods rather than producing them, debts mounted rapidly, and the currency was gradually debased to sustain spending. Inflation surged, industry weakened, and within decades, the richest empire on earth found itself bankrupt. Spain's collapse was not caused by a lack of resources, but by the illusion of endless wealth. When silver flowed in without limit, domestic production declined. Why manufacture goods when they could be imported? Why innovate when spending was easier than building? Wealth flowed through Spain, but very little remained. The economy became dependent on external supply, while internal productivity weakened. When silver shipments slowed and debts remained, the system had no foundation left to support itself. 3 centuries later, Britain commanded the largest empire in human history. The pound sterling anchored global finance, London was the center of world trade, and the Royal Navy controlled the seas. To everyone living inside that era, British dominance looked permanent. But behind the prestige was a simple problem. A global empire is not a trophy. It is a machine that must be paid for every single day. Bases, fleets, colonies, shipping lanes, intelligence networks, everything required constant spending. And the larger the empire became, the more expensive it was just to keep it running. The true turning point arrived with the World Wars. Maintaining global dominance during total war required borrowing on a scale never seen before. Britain sold overseas assets, drained its gold reserves, and relied heavily on loans from the United States to finance the fight. Victory came, but it came with consequences that could not be reversed. The empire survived the war, yet its financial foundation was permanently weakened. Debt replaced accumulated wealth, and the nation that once financed the world became increasingly dependent on foreign credit just to sustain its global position. After the wars, Britain attempted to preserve the image of financial strength by restoring the pound to its pre-war value. In reality, the currency was overvalued and the domestic economy struggled under the pressure. Exports declined, unemployment rose, and industry weakened. Eventually, the government abandoned the gold standard and the pound lost a significant portion of its value. Confidence eroded, Colonies moved toward independence, and within a generation, the empire that once spanned the globe existed mostly in history books. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two global superpowers. It possessed nuclear weapons, vast natural resources, and political influence stretching across Eastern Europe and deep into Asia. To the outside world, the system appeared disciplined, powerful, and unstoppable. Yet beneath that image, the economic foundation was weakening. Central planning reduced efficiency, innovation slowed, and productivity lagged behind technological progress in rival nations. The state could command factories to produce, but it could not create true prosperity or sustainable growth. To compete with the United States, the Soviet Union devoted an enormous share of its economy to military power. Maintaining nuclear parity, producing missiles and tanks, and sustaining influence across multiple regions required constant investment and vast industrial output. Resources that could have improved living standards or modernized civilian industry were redirected into defense and geopolitical competition. The system continued to function, but growth slowed. Shortages became common, and everyday life reflected a widening gap between military strength and economic reality. By the late 20th century, the Soviet economy had entered a prolonged period of stagnation. Factories continued operating, but productivity declined and technological progress lagged behind the West. Consumer goods were scarce, infrastructure deteriorated, and long queues became a normal part of daily life. The system could maintain order, yet it struggled to deliver prosperity. Without innovation and economic flexibility, growth slowed to a crawl while the demands of maintaining superpower status continued to rise. For years, high oil prices helped sustain the Soviet system despite its internal weaknesses. Energy exports brought in hard currency and masked structural inefficiencies across the economy. But when global oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, that financial cushion disappeared almost overnight. Revenue shrank, shortages intensified, and the government struggled to meet basic obligations. Without sufficient income to support both domestic stability and global commitments, the pressure on the system increased rapidly. In 1989, the Soviet sphere of influence began to unravel with astonishing speed. Governments across Eastern Europe collapsed one after another as protests grew, borders opened, and political control weakened. The Berlin Wall, once the most visible symbol of division and power, suddenly opened, signaling that the system could no longer enforce its authority. These events were not isolated uprisings, they revealed a deeper reality. The Soviet Union no longer possessed the economic strength, political leverage, or internal stability required to sustain its empire. By 1991, the Soviet Union could no longer sustain the pressures building inside the system. Economic breakdown intensified, shortages worsened, and political authority weakened across the republics. The government struggled to pay workers, maintain services, and preserve order. What had once appeared to be a permanent superpower dissolved with shocking speed. In December of that year, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, not because it was conquered, but because its economic foundation and political cohesion had collapsed from within. Despite differences in ideology, geography, and time period, the pattern remained strikingly consistent. Each superpower expanded its influence beyond sustainable limits. Military commitments multiplied, debt increased, and economic productivity failed to keep pace with global ambitions. Currency strength weakened, internal pressures mounted, and social stability began to erode. Collapse did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It emerged gradually, as structural weaknesses accumulated until the system could no longer support its own weight. Today's global system appears stable on the surface. Trade networks connect continents, financial markets operate without pause, and digital transactions move trillions of dollars every day. Yet maintaining this level of global integration requires unprecedented spending and coordination. Military alliances span the planet, supply chains stretch across oceans, and governments rely increasingly on debt to sustain growth. The structure is powerful, but its complexity creates fragility, and even small disruptions can send shockwaves through the entire system. In recent years, the pressure on the global system has become increasingly visible. Nations are seeking greater economic independence, diversifying trade partnerships, and reducing reliance on single financial centers. Supply chains are being redesigned, regional alliances are strengthening, and strategic industries are being relocated closer to domestic markets. Governments are prioritizing resilience over efficiency, even when it increases costs. These shifts do not signal immediate collapse, but they reveal a growing awareness that excessive dependence creates vulnerability. In a world defined by uncertainty, stability is no longer taken for granted, and the structure that once seemed permanent is beginning to adjust under rising strain. Global financial systems ultimately depend on confidence. Currencies hold value because nations, institutions, and markets trust their stability and long-term reliability. When that trust begins to weaken, even gradually, ripple effects spread across trade, investment flows, and international cooperation. Countries diversify reserves, central banks increase gold holdings, and bilateral agreements begin bypassing traditional financial channels. None of these changes trigger immediate crisis, but together they signal a slow shift in confidence. And once trust begins to erode, restoring it requires far more time and stability than it took to build in the first place. History shows that superpowers do not collapse because they suddenly become weak. They collapse because the systems that sustain their power grow too complex, too expensive, and too dependent on fragile balances. Expansion creates obligations, debt replaces production, and confidence slowly erodes beneath the surface of apparent stability. For those living through the transition, change feels sudden and shocking. In reality, it has been building for decades. The pattern has repeated across centuries, cultures, and ideologies, reminding us that dominance is never permanent. The question is not whether the global order will change, but how it will transform, and who will be prepared when that moment arrives.